So there are two theories for how the gas giants formed. One is the same theory I showed you just now, core accretion, right? And the other is called disk instability. And one of our colleagues at DTM has done a lot of work on that. And so it's unclear exactly how they formed, but you're right, what we're trying to do, the reason we're trying to get to higher and higher pressure in the lab is because we're trying to understand more about the pressure inside the gas giants. It's thought that the gas giants also have a metallic core, but maybe a metallic core not made of iron. Hydrogen, for example, becomes metallic at a certain pressure. Okay, so it's very possible that the insides of these planets could have metallic cores, could have hydrogen cores, could have rocky portions. We're not sure.
Hello everyone. Today's lecture is about setting up a website. I'm going to be focusing on things that you need to consider to ensure your website really adds value to the people using it. So, there are three main areas you need to think about. The first and most important thing is who is your target audience. When you're creating a new website, you really need to think about who the users are and what information they'll be looking for. What we do when we set up websites is to group users based on their needs. So, for a website in the academic community, for example, we may have groups such as researchers and administrators, and this helps us design the site and add information that is relevant to each group. The second point is accessibility.
Supersymmetry is a mathematical idea that people have developed in effort to understand the sharpest organizing principle for the fundamental constituents of matter. You see, we have learned that particles that seem to be different can actually secretly be united by certain symmetry principles. So we're used to the fact that there are symmetric objects in the world like a sphere or a basketball. You turn a sphere, and even though you've transformed it, it looks the same, fundamentally. We found that certain particles, when you transform one particle into another, even though it looks like the identity of the particle has changed, overall the equations describing it, they don't change at all, an underlying level of symmetry. But what we've not been able to do is find a symmetry that would relate certain kinds of particles.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, As you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue.
From reading philosophy, I came up with 3 principles as the guiding principles for a just city. The principles of equity, democracy, and diversity. These were derived from the works of a number of philosophers, most preeminently, I suppose, John Rawls. My choice of the word equity rather than equality is in fact based on Rawls's argument that a policy ought to distribute benefits to people where the worst off become better off. So the worst off don't have to become equal to everybody else, but no policy should in fact make those who are most disadvantaged more disadvantaged. And it means that we have to talk about the policy at the time it's being enacted.
Conduct disorder in children is very serious. It's a disorder of childhood and adolescence that is long-term, that's chronic, where children have very aggressive impulses, where children are involved in difficulties with the law and really seem to have no disregard for the rules or for authority. When children have conduct disorder, they're definitely at risk of carrying these difficulties into adulthood, which also brings about a myriad of different problems. Children with conduct disorder often have difficulties in schools, have difficulty with relationships, and have difficulty with employment and lifelong, long-term relationships.
Suppose that it has always been the case for the majority of us that the first test of a work of art, or literature, or music is how much pleasure it gives us, and we don't want to bother with analysing why or how it has had such an emotional impact on us. It's always good to know what your pleasures are in the positive sense, and not as easy as some people think, as opposed to only really knowing what you don't like and complaining about it. Though presumably there's some kind of pleasure to be had from that too. But now that you've chosen to take a course on the novel, I'm afraid that evaluating literature on the basis of how you feel about a book won't as an intelligent, critical response to the work being studied.
An article that you wrote that I just read said you wished you could take everyone back to decades ago to look at the Florida Keys.
50 years ago, think about how much change has taken place in that short period of time. We have managed to consume on the order of 90% of the big fish in the ocean, the tunas, the swordfish, the sharks. They're mostly gone. until recently, people have had the belief that there isn't much we puny human beings could do to change the nature of the ocean, but in fact, we have, not just because of what we've been taking out, and the destructive means often applied to take fish and other creatures from the sea, but also what we're putting into the sea, either directly or what we put into the atmosphere that falls back into the sea.
This week I'd like to start by talking a bit about electric vehicles. Although we tend to think of electric cars as being something completely modern, they were in fact some of the earliest types of motorised vehicle. At the beginning of the 20th century, electric cars were actually more popular than cars with an internal combustion engine, as they were more comfortable to ride in. However, as cars fueled by petrol increased in importance, electric declined. The situation became such that electric vehicles were only used for certain specific purposes, as forklift trucks, ambulances, and urban delivery vehicles, for example. Although electricity declined in use in road vehicles, it steadily grew in importance as a means of powering trains.
So, continuing our series of lectures on modernism, we now turn to architecture, and in particular to the work of Frank O'Gehry. Now, I'm not going into his career in detail. It's enough to say that early on he was, like other modernist architects, tied to the rectangle, the straight line, and so on. Often their buildings would have this basic shape, and they would just add bits of decoration like splashes of color or pointless balconies. Soon enough, Gehry wanted to break away from straight lines and grid-like designs. He wanted the freedom to experiment with other shapes, curves, and unusually angled roofs. What helped him was the work with the computer, which allowed him to visualize and experiment with complex shapes and to work on the whole design as one piece, without the added decoration being thrown in as an afterthought.
A dimension of space is basically an independent direction in which, in principle, you could move, you could walk. So when we talk about left-right, you can freely move left-right. Back-forth, you can freely move back-forth. And up-down, you can freely move up-down as well. If you consider a diagonal direction, that's not a new dimension because that's just a combination of moving this way and that way. So when we talk about dimensions, we're talking about the independent directions in which you can move. Another way of thinking about dimensions, they are the data that needs to be specified in order to delineate where something takes place. So if you're having a dinner party, you give your friend a street, a cross street, and a floor number. 3 pieces of information to nail down a location in 3 dimensions of space. There are 4 fundamental forces at work in the universe. Some of them are very familiar from everyday life, some of them are not. So we all know about gravity. That's one of the four forces. It's what keeps us anchored to the surface of the Earth, keeps the Earth in orbit around the sun. There's another force that we're all very familiar with, which is the electromagnetic force. That's the force that is responsible for electricity, electric currents, for light, for the sun's light. That's the electromagnetic radiation coming from the sun to the Earth. There are two other forces, though, that are somewhat less familiar, and they're the nuclear forces. They are forces that are at work within the nuclei of atoms. One of those forces is called the strong nuclear force. That really is a force that binds protons to protons, binds the quarks inside of the protons and neutrons, keeping them from flying out.
One of the keys to Apple is Apple's an incredibly collaborative company. And so, you know how many committees we have at Apple?
No.
0. We have no committees.
No committees.
We are organized like a startup. One person's in charge of iPhone OS software. One person's in charge of Mac hardware. One person's in charge of iPhone hardware engineering. Another person's in charge of worldwide marketing. Another person's in charge of operations. We're organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet. And we all meet for 3 hours once a week, and we talk about everything we're doing, the whole business. And there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company. And teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're going to come through with their parts.
Across the world, people have been watching the choice that Britain has made. I would reassure those markets and investors that Britain's economy is fundamentally strong. And I would also reassure Brits living in European countries and European citizens living here that there will be no immediate changes in your circumstances. There will be no initial change in the way our people can travel, in the way our goods can move, or the way our services can be sold. We must now prepare for a negotiation with the European Union. This will need to involve the full engagement of the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland governments to ensure that the interests of all parts of our United Kingdom are protected and advanced. But above all, this will require strong, determined and committed leadership.
Okay, to help you with your research, I just wanted to give you some tips today on using focus groups. These are groups of people that you get together to find out about their opinions and attitudes. For example, to review a piece of work, or just basically provide some collective input to help you with whatever you're researching. First of all, how large should a focus group be? Well, I would say that an ideal number of participants is around 6 or 7. If it's any bigger, what quite often happens is they break into side conversations and the focus is lost. If it's any smaller, you may not get the range of views that you need to get a really good discussion. Secondly, it's important that you have a moderator for the group who's able to facilitate and guide the discussions.
actually have seen more than one of these black hole emergers. We've seen actually two about equally good, although the one that we talked about, you can see with your eyes. The second one is one with lighter black holes in it, so they're not so heavy, and the ringing is a lot longer, and you can't see it without all the fancy data analysis. And then there's a third source, which we already have published, but now that we have seen that, the other one, we also believe that could very well be a black hole pair. So we have three sources, let's call it three sources, in 3 months. Now, if we make design sensitivity, we have improved the apparatus by another factor of 3. Now, how does that translate into rate? It turns out if you look with a sensitivity 3 times better than we have, you can look 3 times deeper into the universe.
The internet is changing everything. The world of language in the future is totally different from the world of language in the past. And the reason is quite simple. There is more written language on the internet now than in all the libraries of the world combined. We've never seen anything like it before, and we haven't seen anything yet. When you're talking about the future of a language, we're asking about its long-term prospects. Where do they essentially lie? And my answer is they lie in the young people. They lie especially in the hands of the teenagers. The teenagers are the parents of the next generation of children. If teenagers are going to succeed in maintaining the intergenerational transmission of a language, then they have got to be enthused about the minority language, the endangered language that their parents and others speak. So how do you get teenagers enthused, is the question.
What I want to look at today is the question of how much technology, a pen can indeed be called technology, perhaps I should say the instrument of writing, affects a writer's style and level of production. I also want to consider other factors that may have an effect on prose style, such as personality, educational background, and so on. Now, production levels are so hard to measure in relation to the writing instrument used. The quill pen, for instance, would need continual refilling and resharpening, which led to a leisurely, balanced style of prose, full of simple sentences. Writing took a lot longer than now, and the great novelists of the 18th century, Fielding, Smollett, Richardson, had a relatively small output, though some of their books ran to enormous length.
As we all know, it has long been the habit in many countries that teachers give homework to school children of all ages. Despite the fact that a minority of educators don't agree with this practice, it has never seriously been questioned or challenged before. However, it may be that the tide is turning. These days, more people are becoming convinced that homework has virtually no benefit, particularly for children in the younger age group. So, why have teachers always given homework? Well, the answer seems to be because they are obliged to. Most teachers don't really believe it has any real value, and the latest research supports the teachers' feelings about it. Not only does homework have very little impact on children's learning, but it also puts unnecessary obligations and responsibilities onto the parents.
Now, as urban planners, what we really need to start considering is the amount of space allocated for residential areas within a city or town. And when I say space, I'm talking about space within a dwelling or home, rather than the actual size of residential areas. There's growing concern. The internal space of new homes is becoming far smaller, too small, in fact. Maybe you're thinking, is it important for residents to have sufficient space? Merely a preference to have more space, or are there more serious implications? Is there, in fact, any evidence suggests cramped living conditions affect residents' physical or mental well-being or their day-to-day life? Well, research from a number of sources indicates that this is an important issue which needs addressing.
So today, we're continuing to talk about the social history of foodstuffs, and we're going on to consider next the importance of salt and the significant role it has played. Salt was a highly valued commodity in ancient times, not because it made food taste nicer, but because of the way it could be used to preserve food. This meant that people were not so dependent on seasonal variations in what was available for them to eat. They could preserve what they produced and consume it as required. It also meant that food could be transported long distances. Salt was not easy to obtain, and so prices for it were high. It was often necessary to transport it long distances, and it is believed that one of the reasons for building some of the roads that led to the ancient city of Rome was to make it easier to bring salt to the city from various parts of the Roman Empire.
Now, you might think it strange that in a lecture on biology, I'll be talking a lot about mathematics. If I may digress a bit, when I was a student, mathematics, the language of clear abstraction, had nothing to do with life sciences like biology, the sphere of messy organic forms, cutting up frogs in the lab and so on. In fact, I started doing biology precisely to avoid maths and physics. So I've had a lot of catching up to do. We are all aware of how the sciences have come to interrelate more and more, and not only will mathematics impinge more and more on biology, but also, I am told, in the 21st century, the driving force behind mathematics will be biology. This is partly because mathematicians are always on the lookout for more areas to conquer.
It is almost impossible these days not to include photography in a course on the history of art. I agree with people such as Walter Benjamin, who suggest that technology and art don't go well together. Photography, with its realism, its accurate representation of the thing in front of you, actually deprived many artists of their subject matter, forcing them to look in new ways. No bad thing. True, mass-produced images of, say, the Mona Lisa obviously can't provide the same experience as seeing the real painting. On the other hand, photographs which, to my mind, are far more thought-provoking and have greater emotional impact than a painting of the same subject ever could. Some people say that the traditional idea of an artist with a trained hand and eye is old-fashioned. They no longer believe that an artist needs specialist knowledge, but rather that he or she can simply point a camera at a scene and record it. However, on the one hand, that was the creative skill involved in producing photographs. On the other hand, it also ignores the fact, even in the past, painters used various technological aids. For example, the Dutch painter Vermeer used a camera obscura to help him create his images. We'll go into that later, but for now, I want to look at the documentary and cultural value of photography.
Today, I want to look at some research that has been done into what motivates people, and particularly on what is called the mindset, or more simply, the attitude that highly motivated people have, and, of course, the attitude of those who aren't so motivated, or who lose their motivation. Now, it's obvious that motivation is crucial to performance, but that doesn't tell us where it comes from. Why is it that some people work hard and do well, while others can work hard and don't? Why some are committed to what they are doing and others aren't? Finding answers to this question is extremely useful to educators, as well as in other areas of life. For example, I've long believed that financial incentives, bonuses, perks, pay rises, are the great motivators, and to an extent make a difference. What we are calling the mindset is more important.
There was a time when the subject of happiness was the business of philosophers, as part of their discussion of what makes for the good life. Then, much later, psychologists and sociologists got in on the act, and now, it seems, so has the government. I understand that governments should have the welfare and well-being of those it governs at heart, from the purely practical point of view of keeping people quiet, at home enjoying their gadgets and comfort, rather than on the streets rioting. But surely it's not something you can legislate for. Today, there are numerous journals on the topic, and it is even included in the curriculum at some universities and colleges. Surveys are done, statistics compiled, graphs drawn, yet all they seem to prove is what most people have concluded themselves from personal experience.
One of the most surprising insights from Einstein is that time is not what we intuitively think it is, right? Most of us have this sense that time for you is the same as time for me. In some sense, there's this cosmic clock that's out there ticking second after second after second, dragging us all in exactly the same way into the future. Einstein found that if you and I are moving relative to each other, however, our clocks don't tick off time at the same rate. Our watches, if they were once in sync, if we're moving relative to each other, they fall out of synchronization. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that what I consider to be happening right now at a given moment, from your perspective, that might be the past, or it might be the future. What you consider to be happening right now, to me, that may be the past or the future. Now, since your view of reality is every bit as valid as my view of reality, Quantum foam is an idea that emerges from the application of quantum physics to the fabric of space and time itself. You see, Einstein taught us in general relativity that space and time are not an inert backdrop. They participate in the unfolding of the cosmos. Space and time can warp and curve, and that creates the force of gravity. When you recognize that space and time are dynamic, they can change, that they're real physical entities, well, then they must be subject to the laws of quantum physics. And the key element of quantum physics that's relevant is the uncertainty principle. When applied to space and time, it says space and time are uncertain, which means they can wildly fluctuate. They can, in a sense, look like the violently boiling surface of a pot of water when you examine space and time on fantastically small scales.
To be a British, the first and important thing is the freedom of speech that we have. It doesn't matter how small you are or how big you are able to shout. I think security is very important. It's a society that has a democracy as its basic values. There are people who come from a third world which wasn't a British colony, where they did not have democracy as such, where they grew up under what I call a law lord, or a system where the king or the local headman was the ruler of that particular area, and he laid down the laws. And there are still parts of Africa as well as Middle East where the system still exists. They have to follow that ritual, and that's it. They cannot argue against it. While in our British society we can argue. As the American saying go, we can fight the city hall. And this is one thing which is very unique among the Western civilization.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard, and you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, if you're not having fun doing it, and you don't really love it, you're going to give up. And that's what happens to most people, actually. If you really look at the ones that ended up being successful, unquote, in the eyes of society, and the ones that didn't, oftentimes it's the ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere when it got really tough. And the ones that didn't love it quit because they're sane, right? Who would want to put up with this stuff if you don't love it? So it's a lot of hard work, and it's a lot of worrying constantly. And if you don't love it, you're going to fail.
What matters is how much does each person in a household get? How much income is supporting each person in a household? Look what happens when we take that 18% figure. And again, the figure I'll remind you is from 1976 until 2006, in inflation-adjusted terms, the income of the median household income in America rose only by 18%. But at the same time, the size of the household has fallen. So what's happened to the average income per person in the household? Per household person income, if you look at the income per each individual in the household over that 30-year period, we see that that rose not by 18%, but by 32%. Because the number of people in a household has fallen, the amount of income earned by the household goes further per person.
How much sun exposure might one need to get their target vitamin D level to that found associated with the lowest total mortality rate? Well, it depends. It depends on our age, how long we're exposed, the time of day, the time of year, our latitude, our skin color, our use of sunscreen, how much of our body we're exposing. Even in Boston, though, all it takes is 10 to 12 minutes of midday summer sun without sunblock if you're a young, pale, naked Caucasian. But then you're golden. Actually, you'd be a little pink. Note, though, if you're some old white guy prancing around naked on the commons, you're not gonna make it. As I hope you're beginning to appreciate, it's not easy to make a one-size-fits-all recommendation for how much sun exposure one might need. And low vitamin D status, despite abundant sun exposure, has been found even in the best of circumstances.
Vitamin E supplementation confirmed as a treatment for liver problems. Hi, I'm Dr. James Machino. There's a common fatty liver condition known as NASH, which is commonly seen in diabetics and pre-diabetics and people who are overweight. Now, NASH stands for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So it's a condition where you have an inflamed liver that's not caused from alcohol consumption. It's caused by faulty lifestyle behaviors, lots of fat in the diet in particular. Now, of course, alcohol consumption can also induce fatty liver problems. But with the obesity epidemic that we have at hand, more and more people are developing fatty liver disease, not from alcohol, but from faulty dietary lifestyle patterns and lack of exercise. If it's left unchecked, fatty liver problems can degenerate into cirrhosis. Now, in cirrhosis of the liver, you're getting scar tissue and fibrotic tissue, and nodules start to replace normal liver tissue.
The American people are fed up with partisan politics. In a recent Gallup poll, Americans named dissatisfaction with government as the #1 problem facing the country today. Americans now believe our government is more of a problem than the economy, education, and terrorism. To change the way our elected officials work for the American people, we must change how they are elected. We need to start with the first round of voting, the primaries. Thanks to gerrymandering and other factors, the primary election is often the only election that matters. In many states, less than 5% of the electorate are actually deciding who represents 100% of that district or state. That means our elected officials are actually chosen by an increasingly tiny, often incredibly partisan slice of the electorate. Today, 42% of Americans identify themselves as independents.
Today's economy. Materials are extracted, products manufactured, used and thrown away at as low a cost as possible. This cycle is not only polluting, it is unsustainable in a planet with limited resources. But it can be improved. Have you heard about the circular economy? Products stay in the economy for longer, and at the end of their life, they are reused, repaired, remanufactured, upgraded or recycled. Truly creating a circular economy could give a €1.8 trillion boost to the European economy. That's the same amount as Italy's entire economy. It would also be good for the environment, reducing the damaging extraction of raw materials, improving air quality by reducing incineration, and preventing toxic residues leaking into the soil through landfill waste sites.
The green economy could easily be the next industrial revolution. I mean, energy is, we all need energy. We do an annual report which studies how much oil is left in the world and demand for oil. And with China, India, South America, Africa even, growing at the rate they're now growing, we think about 4 or 5 years from now, the demand for fuel will exceed supply. That could push, prices through the roof. And for that reason, forget global warming for 1 minute, just for that reason alone, we should be hurrying up, saving on energy and creating alternative sources of energy. And I think those people who invest in this sector, hopefully, will get their thanks. And get their just returns.
What nutritional guidelines should we be following?
Well, probably the best source of nutritional guidelines are those that are issued by the American Cancer Society or the National Cancer Institute. And the American Cancer Society, for example, offers 4 really basic, simple nutrition guidelines. The first guideline, which in my mind is the most important, is to choose most of the foods that you eat from plant sources. And we can talk in more detail about that in a moment. The second guideline is to limit your intake of high-fat foods, particularly from animal sources. The third guideline is to be physically active and achieve a normal, healthy body weight. And the final guideline is to limit consumption of alcoholic beverages if you choose to drink at all.
So, Susan, one of the things we always hear about from the American Cancer Society is this 5-a-day recommendation. Maybe if you could explain to our listening audience what that actually means.
The 5-a-day recommendation is a very simple way of communicating the message to increase consumption of these plant foods. And what 5 a day means is 5 servings per day of fruits and vegetables in total. And some people misunderstand this guideline, and they may think it's okay if I have 5 glasses of fruit juice a day and I've met my 5-a-day guideline. But the goal is really to choose both fruits and vegetables as part of the 5-a-day guideline, to vary the fruits and vegetables that you eat on a daily basis, and that alone is a very major step forward in terms of reducing your risk for cancer.
All right. So, for example, if now this is interesting. If your eyeballs are in the front of your face, you're seeing things. The part of the brain that lights up when you see something is actually back here. All right. So if you actually were watching, like in my class, I'm sure the PowerPoints are to die for, and so the part of the brain that's activated at that moment is way back there. If I'm giving the speech of a lifetime and my students are like, more, more, I'm like, this is the part of the brain that lights up, for example. I mean, I'm just sort of characterizing it here. Interestingly enough, if that's all you did, you're lecturing, you're giving presentations, that's it. There's a whole bunch of other areas of the brain that does not tend to get activated if all you're really doing is the kind of traditional didactic approach.
I'm Steve Pinker, and I'm a Harvard College professor and John Stone Family Professor here at Harvard in the Department of Psychology. The cognitive revolution, which took place at Harvard, was the start of the modern scientific study of the mind. Because when you study something like the mind, and you like to think that you're a scientist, you're faced with the immediate problem of what do we do with these things called mental contents, thoughts, emotions, images, plans, rules. You can't see them, you can't taste them, you can't feel them. If you're a scientist, you're supposed to be studying things that you can see and measure and manipulate. How do you even begin with a science of mind? Well, the answer that had dominated psychology in the middle part of the 20th century was to just give up all talk of mental contents.
Infinity is a perplexing idea which basically refers to something that grows without bound. No matter what number you might assign to something, infinity will be larger than that number. We make use of infinity in a number of ways in physics. We imagine that space conceivably could go on infinitely far. We imagine that in principle the universe could go on for an infinite amount of time. But in our calculations, if infinity turns up as the answer to something that we could directly measure with a piece of equipment, then we know that our calculation must be wrong. And we have used that as a diagnostic over many decades to tell us if you find infinity popping out of your equations for something you can measure, you better go back. Think about those equations, modify them in some way in order to get a finite answer, as that's the only kind of answer that we could ever directly measure.
Some years ago, a group of academics from different disciplines recognised the necessity of studying conflict as a phenomenon. They were interested in the distinct properties of conflict as it occurred in international relations, national politics, industrial relations, communities, or even in the domestic setting. These academics believed that approaches from different disciplines could be applied to the study of conflict with a view to better understanding its causes, effects and solutions. As a result, research groups developed, and universities and academic journals began to publish papers on conflict theory, as it came to be called. Unfortunately, many other academics didn't welcome this new discipline. They couldn't reconcile it with traditional scholarly practices because it had both a practical nature and an analytical approach.
The brand is the talent. And let's stick with that sports analogy. The answer is you can spend $450 million on a stadium, but if over a 10-year period the player talent's no good and there are more losses than there are wins, there are going to be a lot more empty seats than there are full ones, right? No matter how good the marketing is and no matter how beautiful the stadium is. The brand is the talent. Bennis and Biederman again. The leaders of great groups love talent and know where to find it. They revel in the talent of others. Only in the stupid world of business and government do we promote the best accountant to the head of the accounting department, the best salesman to the head of the sales department, the best trainer to the head of the training department. You don't do that in sports, right?
So today we're going to talk about children's literature and the role it plays in society. Throughout history, adults have used the power of stories to entertain and amuse their children. But stories are not used merely to entertain youngsters. They have a significant educational purpose. They serve to teach the moral values of their society. In sociological terms, stories are one of the means by which children are socialized. How does this work in practice? Well, it often makes use of heroes, the characters in the stories who the children will admire and want to be like. The heroes of children's stories, therefore, exemplify the qualities valued by that society. They will typically demonstrate courage in the face of difficulty, honesty, consideration for others, loyalty to their family and friends, a respect for work, and so on.
We often think of technology and invention and research as being somehow more sophisticated a proposition than nature. But actually, when we think about it, there are lots of really useful concepts that technology can take from the natural world. People are beginning to remember that other organisms on Earth are doing things in a very similar way to what we need to do. And they're looking closely at what we can learn from nature. Take the bright screens on our mobile phones. Now, this brightness, this effect that they've managed to achieve there, came partly as a result of research into the iridescence of the wings of butterflies and the anti-reflective coatings that moths have on their eyes.
As physicists try to explain the masses of particles, they found that if they just tried to inject the mass into the mathematical equations in the most straightforward way, just put a parameter for the mass of a particle right into the math didn't work. It gave rise to quantum mechanically inconsistent features. So it was recognized that you needed to have a more subtle way of introducing mass into the equations that would not spoil the fundamental symmetries, but yet would allow the particles to have different masses. You see, fundamentally, the idea is that all particles begin life as being massless. There's a high degree of symmetry associated with that. All of the particles have the same mass, 0. How do you inject mass without spoiling that symmetry, which is vital for the equations to make sense?
Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1527. The philosopher Bertrand Russell referred to Machiavelli's most well-known book, The Prince, as a gangster's handbook. And while there's no doubt that certain people have read and used it as such, I think that if we put it into the context of when it was written, which was Italy, especially Florence, in the 15th and 16th centuries, it will be easier to judge Machiavelli's reasons for writing it. Now, the Italy of that period was made up of a number of city-states, often at war with each other. Add to that threats from foreign powers, especially France, and it was a very unstable and dangerous situation. Machiavelli loved his home city, Florence, and wanted to protect its culture, history, and above all, independence at all costs. One way to do this was to establish an army of Florentines loyal to the city-state of Florence.
We appear to take it as a rule, or as a law of nature, that each species is adapted to the climate of its own home. For example, species from the Arctic, or even a temperate region, could not survive in a tropical climate, nor could a tropical species last long if it found itself at the South Pole. But it is true to say there's too much emphasis placed on the degree of adaptation of species to the climates where they live. We assume that this adaptation, if all species are descended from a single form, must have taken place over millions of years. Yet a large number of plants and animals brought from different countries remain perfectly healthy in their new home. Also, there are several examples of animal species that have extended their range within historical times from warmer to cooler latitudes and the other way round.
The way it started really is I was doing this type of work in the United States where there are a number of lawyers doing it, and had not been done in the UK or the rest of Europe before. And I think the reason it started in the United States was that there was a civil rights movement, and in the civil rights movement lawyers became deeply involved right away, because if you were black and asserted your rights you were arrested. Then some very foresightful funders saw the environmental movement coming along just behind the civil rights movement in time and said, we need lawyers in the environmental movement as well. As a result, one of the main contributors to the environmental movement in the United States have been all these lawyers.
Most of what the general public knows about daily life in ancient Rome comes from art, architecture and literature, which tell us more about the elites, especially the goings-on of the emperors. But how much do we know of the lives of ordinary Romans? Did they have a voice, apart, that is, from what we can gather from graffiti? The usual picture is one of time spent at festivals, baths and typically the games. However, for many Romans, terrible living conditions, poverty, debt and the chance of being sold into slavery at any moment, that is, if they weren't slaves already, left no time or energy for such forms of entertainment, or for any interest in politics for that matter.